Now, Acting Manager of Governance, Risk and Compliance at Transnet, Helen Walsh, says Transnet has so far paid 42 billion rand for relocation fees, transaction advisory fees and all the locomotives transactions. However, commitments for further payments still stand. Walsh was giving evidence before the state capture inquiry, which has now moved its focus to Transnet. Walsh says contracts for advisory services with Regiments and McKinsey, who were paid over 300 million rand in consulting fees, have been terminated. She provided the Commission with documentation to prove claims and payments made by Transnet to locomotive service providers from 2015 to 2019. Walsh says during her time in Transnet's finance department, she was responsible for payment verifications and ensuring that process owners had signed invoices. She says the process owners were responsible for ensuring that the work was done for all payments made. The Commission will resume with former Transnet electrical engineer Francis Callard's testimony tomorrow morning. Now, for more on this, I'm joined by Mbalenhle Mthethwa, who has been following the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. Very good afternoon to Mbalenhle. The issue of figures and amounts paid for locomotives coming up quite a lot today.
Yes, definitely. So we had today's witness basically going through all the amounts that were spent on the different business cases. So we know about the locomotives that were purchased by Transnet, which is the first one, the 95 locomotives, the second business case, the 100 locomotives, and the one very controversial one, the 1065 locomotives contract, which we've heard evidence relating to how costs escalated from just over 30 million rand to over 30 billion rand rather to over 50 billion rand. And we've heard about how those cost escalations were rather unjustified, and how Brian Molefe, then CEO Brian Molefe, had misled the board by informing that they didn't need to go back to the Department of Public Enterprises in order for this payment to have been increased. So that's what we've heard so far relating to these transactions. But another thing that is also included in this 42 billion rand is the amount that was spent on a relocation, a supposed relocation, which really never happened. This was supposed to be a relocation from Pretoria to Durban, and at the time it didn't happen because at the time there was nothing to relocate. None of the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, had actually set up shop in Pretoria, and there was nothing to really relocate to Durban. And these are all these amounts that are included there. But another thing that really stood out for me is the amount that was spent towards transaction advisory services. We've heard from various witnesses saying that it was not necessary for Transnet to even have gotten transaction advisors. However, they did spend something like 305 million rand to pay 305 million rand to Regiment's Capital, which we know is a Gupta-linked company. And we also know that they also spent they also gave McKinsey around 11 million rand for their transaction advisory services. So that's a huge amount of over 316 million rand that was spent on transaction advisory fees alone.
Very interesting things coming out at that inquiry. In Mbalenhle, we also know that Francis Collard is coming back. It's not the first time that he's appeared before the inquiry. What's happening there?
Okay, so Francis Collard is appearing for a second time, as you mentioned, and he's basically here to answer two questions that were brought about from the last testimony he gave, which implicated a certain individual from Transnet, and he's basically questioning some of the evidence that he's given. So Francis Collard had questioned the amounts and the justifications that were used to escalate some of the costs. One of the business cases that he spoke about was the 100 locomotives, which was originally supposed to be a confinement of 100 locomotives to Mitsui, which was a Japanese company. But this was later changed to, this was not approved, and later changed to become China South Rail confinement for 100 locomotives. And this went ahead despite him saying that, their locomotives were not really configured to the South African market, and that Mitsui was actually better placed to provide these 100 locomotives. And basically this went ahead, and we've also heard evidence from various witnesses saying that, China South Rail did enjoy somewhat of a special relationship with Transnet. We've heard about certain irregularities and how many contracts were basically changed to favor China South Rail at Transnet. But the issue at hand here is how one of the justifications was the exchange rate, and he basically testified that, Francis Callot that is, testified that initially they'd used the wrong foreign exchange rate, which was the Japanese yen, instead of the Japanese, the Japanese currency is running away from me, but the Japanese currency instead of the Chinese yuan. So that was one of the reasons why he believed that the justifications were unjustified and were unreasonable, and they would used the wrong kind of, and he was basically testifying to that, and he basically still maintains that there was no justifiable reason for the different exchange rates that were used to justify the cost escalations in those business cases. But we expect him to continue and come in tomorrow morning. We expect him to only testify for another 2 hours before we move on to the next witness.
Balenhle Mthethwa giving us a wrap-up of what happened at the State Capture Commission of Inquiry and also what's going to come. She's following that story, very knowledgeable, and will keep us updated.